A wall could not stop them. A river could not stop them. Winter could not stop them. In little more than a generation, one force of horsemen swept across more land than any empire before it, from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Europe. To the people who watched it coming, it looked impossible. Whole armies vanished in a single afternoon. Great cities, protected by walls that had stood for centuries, fell in days, not months. Kings, who ruled enormous kingdoms, surrendered without even seeing the enemy's main force. It looked like magic, or like a curse sent down from the sky. But it was not magic. The storm had a system. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, how a small group of nomads built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, larger than Rome at its height, larger than any contiguous land empire that had come before. And it is also the story of why the same force that built this empire could not hold it together. This is the story of the Whirlwind. Long before the conquests began, the Mongol way of life was already shaping a weapon. The story starts not with a leader, but with a landscape. The Mongolian steppe is wide, dry, and harsh. Few crops grow there. Summers are short. Winters are brutal, with temperatures that can freeze a river solid in a single night. Farming was difficult and unreliable on much of this land, so Mongol families did not rely on it. Instead, they followed their herds of sheep, goats, and horses across the open grassland, moving camp again and again through the seasons. In this world, the horse was not a luxury. It was survival itself. Children learned to ride almost before they could walk steadily on their own feet. By the time a boy became a man, he had already spent a lifetime in the saddle, hunting, herding, and traveling across enormous distances without complaint. This daily life created skills that no settled kingdom could easily match. Mongol riders could shoot a composite bow at full gallop, hitting a small target while moving faster than most enemy armies could even march. They needed no heavy supply wagons following behind them. Their horses gave them milk. Their herds gave them meat, leather, and felt for their tents. An army built this way could travel light, move fast, and strike without warning, far from any city or supply line. For centuries, this enormous skill stayed scattered and wasted. Mongol tribes raided and fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. Old rivalries and shifting alliances kept the steppe divided into dozens of small, competing groups. The raw weapon already existed, sharpened by generations of hard life. It just had no single hand to hold it, and no single purpose to aim it at. That was about to change. We have already told the personal story of the man who changed everything, the boy who had nothing, and grew up to launch a conquest that changed half the world. If you want that story, watch our video on Genghis Khan. Here, the story is different. Here, it is not about one man's rise. It is about what he built. But skill alone does not build an empire. Someone had to turn survival into strategy. In 1206, after years of war between rival tribes, Genghis Khan united the Mongol clans into a single nation. For the first time, the steppe followed one discipline, one chain of command, one imperial purpose. Tribal loyalty no longer decided who fought beside whom. skill and loyalty to the Khan did. Genghis Khan organized his army into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Promotion came from skill and loyalty, not from noble birth. A skilled herder's son could rise to command thousands of men. Strict laws bound the whole army together, no matter which tribe a soldier came from originally, and no matter how old the conflicts between their families once were. He also built something almost no nomadic leader before him had built: a system of communication and intelligence. Scouts and spies gathered information about enemy kingdoms long before the army ever arrived at their borders. Merchants and travelers, moving freely along trade routes, brought back details about roads, defenses, harvests, and rivalries inside the kingdoms the Mongols planned to face. Messengers carried orders across the empire at incredible speed. For the first time, the steppe's old enemies were forced to fight side by side, under one discipline, answering to one Khan. Genghis Khan also enforced a set of laws and customs often known as the yasa, helping bind the army and the empire together. Among other things, it generally protected priests, monks, and religious leaders of different faiths, as long as they prayed for the Khan's success. This mattered more than it might first seem. Conquered peoples who kept their own beliefs were far less likely to rise up in desperate religious rebellion. This was the turning point. A people who had spent generations fighting each other now turned outward, together, toward the rest of the world. This is no longer a man's story. It is now a machine of conquest, and the machine was finally ready to move. The whirlwind began in the east. Western Xia, a kingdom on the Mongols' southern border, was forced to submit after repeated invasions. Then came the Jin dynasty, ruling much of northern China, worn down over years of brutal, non-stop campaigns, until even their fortified capital could not hold. But it was the Khwarezmian Empire, in Central Asia, that revealed the Mongols' true method to the wider world. When the Khwarezmian ruler insulted Mongol messengers and executed Mongol merchants, Genghis Khan demanded an apology. None came. His response was overwhelming. Within only a few short years, one of the richest and most powerful empires in the Islamic world had completely collapsed. Great cities, like Samarkand and Bukhara, famous for their wealth and learning, were forced to open their gates. Now the world understood this was not a raid. This was a system of conquest. A clear pattern emerged from these campaigns, and it would repeat again and again across Asia. Mongol armies moved with frightening, almost unbelievable speed, often appearing where no one expected an army to be. Cities that surrendered quickly were often spared serious harm. Cities that resisted, however, faced terrible punishment. Terror was real, but it was also carefully planned, almost like a weapon of its own. Cities were not destroyed at random. They were turned into messages, warnings sent ahead to the next city standing in the army's path, encouraging quick surrender rather than costly resistance. And the Mongols did not simply destroy what they conquered. They used it. Skilled administrators, engineers, doctors, and merchants from conquered lands were brought into Mongol service, often given real authority. Local tax systems, postal networks, and trade routes were studied carefully and reused, not thrown away in the chaos of conquest. The storm could conquer faster than most empires could even prepare a defense, and it kept moving forward, because it never stopped for long to build everything again from nothing. By the 1220s, the whirlwind had swallowed an enormous stretch of Asia, from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea. And it was still moving west. In 1223, at the Kalka River, Mongol generals Jebe and Subutai crushed a combined army of Rus's princes and Cuman warriors, far larger than their own forces. It was an early warning sign, but one that few people in Europe truly noticed or understood. Surely, people said, the horsemen would turn back toward Asia. Surely Europe was too far away, too different, too well defended by its castles and its knights. They were wrong. In 1241, under the command of Batu Khan and the brilliant general Subutai, Mongol forces launched a full invasion of Europe. They struck Poland and Hungary almost at the same time, splitting their enemies' attention and preventing the two kingdoms from joining forces. In Poland, a combined army of Polish and German knights was crushed at the Battle of Legnica. Then, at the Battle of Mohi, the army of King Bela IV of Hungary was destroyed in a single, terrible clash. Hungary, one of the strongest kingdoms in Eastern Europe, was thrown into chaos in a matter of weeks. Its army was broken, its king fled, and the road into Central Europe suddenly looked open. Refugees fled west in terror, carrying stories of an enemy that seemed impossible to stop, an enemy that fought differently from anything European knights had trained for. If Hungary could fall this fast, what could stop the whirlwind from reaching Vienna, Rome, or even Paris? For a moment, all of Western Europe seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the storm to arrive at its door. Then, just as Europe seemed completely exposed, the storm turned back. Word arrived from across the continent that the great Khan, Ogedei, had died far away in Mongolia. Mongol princes were expected to look back toward the imperial center, where the next great Khan would be chosen. The storm turned back not because it had been shattered in battle, but because the center of the empire had suddenly become uncertain, and uncertainty mattered more than any battlefield. Europe never learned how close it had truly come to disaster. The whirlwind simply moved on, drawn back toward the heart of its own empire, leaving a continent that would spend generations wondering if it might return. As Mongol rule spread and the great roads came under their protection, something unexpected happened. For the first time in history, a single power controlled almost the entire length of the Silk Road, from China to the Black Sea. This created what historians now call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. This peace was built on conquest, fear, and violence, but once it existed, it connected worlds that had rarely been connected before. Merchants could travel from Europe to China along routes that had once been filled with danger, bandits, and competing local tolls at every border. A relay system called the Yam carried messages and officials across thousands of miles at remarkable speed, using fresh horses and fresh riders at stations spaced along the road, almost like a postal service centuries ahead of its time. Ideas moved as freely as goods along these roads. Paper, gunpowder, printing techniques, and astronomical knowledge spread west toward Europe and the Islamic world. Crops, new technology, and skilled craftsmen moved east in return. Diplomats, missionaries, and traders, including, later, the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, crossed a connected world that had never existed at this scale before in human history. For a brief, remarkable period, A traveler could cross from one end of Asia to the other under the protection of related Mongol-ruled lands. Under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, the Mongol world reached its most impressive imperial form in China. In 1271, he founded the Yuan dynasty. By 1279, he had conquered the southern Song, completing the takeover of all of China. But the larger the storm became, the harder it was to keep it moving in one direction. Underneath that brilliance was a harder truth. The empire was no longer one storm. It had split into four great khanates: the Yuan in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each khanate now ruled in its own way, following its own local interests rather than a single shared purpose. The Golden Horde, ruling over Russian lands, gradually adopted Islam and grew closer to Turkic culture. The Ilkhanate, ruling Persia, took on Persian administration and, in time, the Persian faith as well. The Yuan court, ruling China, increasingly governed like a Chinese dynasty. The single will that once drove the whole whirlwind forward in one direction no longer existed. Four storms now moved across four different skies. Once the empire split into separate khanates, the cracks only widened with each passing year. Kublai Khan, ruler of the wealthiest khanate, tried to extend Mongol power even further across the sea. Twice, in 1274 and 1281, he launched massive invasions of Japan with thousands of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers. Both times, fleets were wrecked by violent storms that the Japanese later called kamikaze, the divine wind. The whirlwind that had crossed entire continents on horseback could not cross open water against the weather. Meanwhile, the very roads that had connected the Mongol world carried more than silk, paper, and ideas. Trade routes that linked China, Central Asia, and Europe also allowed disease to travel faster and farther than ever before in history. In the following century, the Black Death would spread along many of these same connected paths, spreading death across Asia and Europe and killing millions of people. Inside China, Mongol rule grew increasingly unpopular among the people they governed. Heavy taxes, natural disasters, failed harvests, and deep anger toward foreign rulers fed rebellion after rebellion across the countryside. In 1368, Chinese rebels finally overthrew the Yuan dynasty, ending nearly a century of Mongol rule over China and pushing the remaining Mongol nobility back toward the steppe. The whirlwind that had once seemed completely unstoppable had, piece by piece, khanate by khanate, come apart. Here is the lesson hidden inside this story. Speed can win land. Fear can break armies. But neither one can hold a world together forever. The Mongols proved that conquest can create an empire. Ruling one is something else entirely. The Mongol Empire did not survive as one empire, but the world it connected never fully separated again. Roads, trade, diplomacy, fear, and memory, all of it remained, becoming a permanent part of the world that came after. Even today, modern Mongolia still honors Genghis Khan as a founding figure. And the roots the Mongols protected helped shape the connected world that came after. The whirlwind passed, but it changed the map forever. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to EraSpeak for more history told through the language you are learning. See you in the next video.